This lesson is on fractions, and it kind of goes with the lesson that we just had on ruler. Because our ruler is broken into fractions, we need to know a little bit how to deal with fractions. Now, I'm assuming here you've had basic math, so this is really just going to be a little bit of a refresher to kind of get the wheels turning again on how to deal with fractions. But let's just talk about a few situations. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to put two pieces of wood together. Let's say a thinner piece and a thicker piece. Let's say the thinner piece was 5/16 thick, and the thicker piece was 3/8 thick. And I needed to know how thick the whole thing was going to be when it was together, because I had to put screws in and I don't want my screw to come through the other side. So I have to know what's the maximum thickness of wood is so the screw could be shorter than that. But I need to be able to add those two numbers together. So I have to add together 5/16 and 3/8. So if I did it out as a math problem, 3/8 plus 5/16 is kind of what I'm looking for as a math problem. So what's that total thickness? Well, when you add and subtract fractions together, you have to have, fill in the blank, have to have a common denominator, right? What's the denominator? Oh, that's the number on the bottom. So these numbers on the bottom need to be the same. These are 8ths, these are 16ths. Why do I need them to be the same? Well, let's take a look at the ruler for a second, and we can kind of analyze this. So here is, I pulled out an inch, so we're looking at an inch here, and the inch is broken into 16ths on this ruler. So let's look at that for a second. Now an eighth, I've got 3/8. How big is an eighth in 16ths? Well, 2/16 equals an eighth. So there's 1/8, there's 2/8, there's 3/8. All right. I want to add to that 5/16. So let's add 5/16. Now each of these is a 16th. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4. There's your 5/16. So I want to add these 5/16 to those 3/8. Well, my answer is not going to be in eighths, because here's an eighth, an eighth, an eighth, an eighth, an eighth, and oh, this is a half of an eighth. So my answer is obviously going to be in 16ths, because that's what a half of an eighth is. So it's easier, I break the eighths into 16ths so I can just count 16ths. So if I break the eighths in half, it becomes 2/16 each. So here's my 3/8 up to here, so I had 2, 4, 6/16 is the same as 3/8, isn't it? So I have 6/16 plus 5/16. So it's how many 16ths? Well, I could just count them, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 16ths. So I could just do that. I could just look at my ruler and just add up all the little lines and spaces, but that takes a lot of work and a lot of time. And I could miscount on a little teeny ruler. I need to know how to do it mathematically. So let's come back over here. So what did I do there? I changed my eighths into 16ths. So if I chop each eighth in half, right, I'm multiplying it times 2. So I went 8 times 2 to get to the 16. So whatever I do to the bottom of a fraction, I have to do to the top. Remember that? 3 times 2 is 6. So I had 6/16 instead of 3/8. So if I look at 6/16 and add that to 5/16, how many 16ths did I end up with? Because they were broken into 16ths. 6 plus 5 was 11. So that's how you add and subtract fractions. You need that common denominator, and then you just do the simple math across the top. 6 plus 5 is 11. Or if I was doing subtraction, it would be the same concept. I'm not going to repeat that. Now let's say I was adding two pieces of wood together that were the same thickness. Let's say I had two pieces of wood that were 3/4 of an inch thick. Pretty common thickness for lumber. Well, how long of a screw am I going to need for that? Or don't want to make the screw any longer than. All right. So I've got 3/4 and 3/4, and I could just do the math to add them. Right? 3/4 plus 3/4. I already have a common denominator, equals 6/4. And then I would just have to reduce that. 4 goes into 6 once with 2 left over, so that's 2/4. But you always want to reduce your fractions to keep them as low, to the lowest term as you can. So I can make that 2/4 would be the same as 1/2. So my answer, 3/4 plus 3/4 is 1 1/2. The other thing I can do is, I'm basically doing a multiplication project here, if I want to look at it that way. This is 3/4 times 2, right? So how do you multiply fractions? 3/4 times 2. Well, 2 over 1 is still 2, right? So I would multiply this way. So 3 times 2 equals 6, and 4 times 1 equals 4. So I have 6/4, which is what I was here, my same answer as before, and I would end up with the same answer, okay? Let's say I had a different situation where I had a total thickness, and I had, in my plans, it said drill a hole halfway through the lumber. And let's say the lumber was 5/8 thick. So my total thickness is 5/8, and I want to go drill a hole halfway through. So I need to know what half of 5/8 is. So over here I was doing multiplication, here's division, but here's a little trick when it comes to halving, right? If I needed 1/2 of 5/8, right? Whenever you see the word of, you can change it to multiply. So I'm going to multiply 1/2 times 5/8. So 1 times 5 equals 5. 2 times 8 equals 16. So 5/16. So that whole depth, if I wanted to drill halfway through a 5/8 piece of wood, I would drill 5/16 deep. Because 5/16 is half of 5/8. Right? That's a real simple way to do it. Now here's a little shortcut when it comes to doubling or halving. If I had a fraction, let's use the 5/8 we were just using here. Whatever I want to do to the fraction, do the opposite to the bottom number, keep the top number the same. So if I wanted to halve the fraction, keep the top number the same, and do the opposite. Opposite of halving is doubling. I'm going to double the 8, 16. So half of 5/8 is 5/16, and that's the answer we came up with over here, right? It works the same if you wanted to double the fraction. So if I wanted to double 5/8, let's say I had 2 pieces of 5/8 lumber, how thick is that going to be? I could double the fraction by halving the bottom number, right? Here's 5/8. I want to double that number. I'm going to chop the 8 in half. 5/4. Well, 5/4, right, equals 1 1/4. 4 goes into 5 once, with 1 left over, 1/4. So it's a little shortcut. No math formula that goes with it, but very often in woodworking, we have to cut halfway through something. Now another situation you might come up with, this will be my last example, is let's say we got some joinery. I'm making some kind of a box or container, and I'm looking at the edge of the lumber here now. So let's say I've got something that's like this. I've got 2 side pieces that have, this is called a rabbet cut in it, and I've got a piece of wood that fits across here, and I know the overall dimension of this is, let's say, 12 inches. Let me make that a little bit bigger here so we can see it. 12 inches from here to here. Well, I need to know how long do I make that piece of wood, okay? Well, the first thing I have to know is how deep this is. Let's say that this lumber is 5/8 thick on either side, the total thickness of the lumber. But that's not going to help me very much because I need to know this. So I either have to know how deep this cut is in here or what's left over. And I'm going to say that we have in this space here, the remaining part of this joint is 3/16. Where can I write it? I'll write it over here so you can see it. So the distance between here to here, this flat section in here, is 3/16. So the size of this piece of wood is 12 inches minus 3/16 and 3/16 on either side. So the first thing I got to do is add 3/16 together. I can double it. Oh, I just learned how to do that. So I want to double 3/16. If I want to double the fraction, I have the bottom number. So 3/8 total material is going to be shorter than this. This is going to be 3/8 shorter. 3/16 here, 3/16 here. So now I have 12 inches, and I want to subtract, let me do it this way, 3/8 from it. Right? 2 3/16 together. Well, I can't subtract this from here. I have to change 12 to 11 and make this 8/8. Right? So 8/8 is the same as 1, so I just took 1 away from the 12, made it 11, and made 8/8 over on the side. So my answer is going to be 11, and 8/8 minus 3/8 is 5/8. A little bit of math right here. Okay, so the length of my little piece of wood right here is going to be 11 and 5/8 from this point to that point. So a few different ways you're going to use some basic fractional math when you're reading a ruler. Happens in woodworking all the time. So you've got to know how to deal with some basic fractions, and you have to obviously know how to read a ruler. So hopefully this will help you, and you will be an expert woodworker because you know how to read a ruler.